And God stepped out on space, and he looked around and said, I'm lonely. I'll make me a world. And as far as the eye of God could see, darkness covered everything, blacker than 100 midnights down in a cypress swamp. And God smiled, and the light broke. Now, those words come from James Weldon Johnson's poem, The Creation, which I ran into 50 years ago and have never been able to get out of my head ever since, and which actually influenced the title of my first book, as some of you probably already figured out. The moment you start imagining the act of creation, all kinds of questions come into mind. You run up against a list of questions that, if it were strung out, would disappear into the distance. There are so many that have to be answered. I've been watching I think it was a PBS series on the incredible design of the universe. I think it was Our Elegant Universe. And what I've seen so far of it, that scientists keep going deeper and deeper into the atom, and they keep finding that there is more stuff, more things to know about, and one wonders how much there is there that they still haven't located somewhere down in the heart of all things. And the complexity of it is absolutely staggering. But we won't go that direction. That's beyond our capacity, so far beyond my high school physics. But anyway, when you look at the world and you consider the things you have to have, you know water is crucial. Human beings are made up mostly of water. You know it's crucial for the environment. You know it's crucial for the rain. It's crucial to grow crops. It's crucial for food. It's crucial everything. And when you begin to understand the overall ecosystem that is the earth, you understand there has got to be a lot of water, enormous surface area of water from things that you probably have never thought about. I remember years ago there was a tanker that went aground somewhere, just hit a reef right off of the British Isles, spilled. It was a terrible oil spill, dominated the news. Everyone was trying to do their best to clean the thing up, get it under control. And someone in that period of time published an article and said, imagine that tanker had been carrying a herbicide, something that would kill plant life. If that had happened, Britain would have probably suffocated for lack of oxygen. It was fascinating to read because, I mean, everybody knows we breathe in oxygen, we breathe out carbon dioxide. Our plants breathe in carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen, and so we get along nicely with our plants. What I didn't know was that all the plant life, all the trees, all the grass, everything growing in the British Isles was insufficient to supply the oxygen for the British population. They depended on the sea. It was the plant life at the surface of the sea that is the biggest regulator of oxygen on the planet. It isn't the rainforest and all that, as important as those things are. It is the sea. Now, if you think this a little further, you may begin to realize that you're going to have to move that water around. If it all just sits there, stays in one place, it'll become stagnant. A lot of the things that we depend on it for would never happen. So when you have too much hot water in one end of your bathtub, what do? Stick your hand in, swirl it around, right? Move the water. How do we do that with 7 seas, 7 oceans, huge bodies of water? Well, it's fairly simple if you're God. You put a moon around planet Earth, which, as it keeps going round and round, the gravity of the moon moves the tides, moves the oceans, and the weather, of course, that develops eventually creates the currents, like the Gulf Stream, like the Japanese current, which it was a total surprise to me the first time I decided I would go swimming in the Pacific Ocean. Now, I had been to the Gulf of Mexico, went down to Galveston. Water's warm, comfortable, feels good. We ran off to the beach at Ocean Beach in San Diego one time. We were going to go swimming in the ocean. We were going to really enjoy the ocean. Got a few feet deep in the thing and thought I was going to freeze to death. And that's where I learned about something called the Japanese current. That current goes up around the Bering Straits, around Alaska, and comes down the Pacific coast and keeps the Pacific coast quite cool and creates that marvelous climate that California has got. So the moon actually has to be there to do this job, or the world that you and I live in would be vastly different. In fact, maybe impossible for human life as we know it, to even exist on the planet if it weren't for the moon. Now, like our solar system, man is also a system. And there's a lot of things that we need to come to understand about this. We call gravity a law. And in one sense, it certainly is a law. We call all the stuff that make these things work laws. You know, Newton's law, and we know the law that says matter in motion tends to remain in motion, and matter at rest tends to remain at rest. We learn all these things in high school physics. But you need to understand that in the process of talking about this, we can often stumble over semantics, that is, over the meaning of words. Gravity is not a law in the sense of being an enactment. Congress passes laws. Congress passes laws you can break. You actually can break these laws. If it just happens, as a matter of fact, that the policeman's out on coffee break having donuts at Dunkin' Donuts somewhere, you can speed through a town and never get caught and pay no consequences that anybody knows about. So this type of thing happens. But you can't break the law of gravity. Years ago, I remember someone made a comment, I don't remember the context even, but he said, well, you know, I broke the law of gravity. I was up there on that roof and I fell off and broke my arm. No, he didn't break the law of gravity. He obeyed the law of gravity. You can't break the law of gravity. I mean, you break the law of gravity, nothing's going to work anymore because it all comes unstuck. So it's not really a law. It is a property of matter. You follow me? It is just the way things are. It's not a law. The moon is where it is, doing what it does because of a balance between two properties, gravity and motion. It moves, it's on, heading off, but because it passes by the earth, which has a very strong gravitational pull because of huge mass, the moon swirls and comes around the world and goes into orbit. And because the moon itself has a great deal of mass, it affects items on the surface of the planet. Who knows? Maybe it even affects human beings. In his poem, The Creation, James Weldon Johnson pictures God having finished all the creation, standing there looking around at it and feeling, this is really good. And then he says, I'm lonely still. I'll make me a man. Now here is where things start getting interesting for you and me. The man God made was a balance of matter and energy, just like everything else that he had made. He's made of atoms, molecules. He's made of bits and pieces of the dirt of the ground, we are told. And in the process of this, we come to a singular problem. Like the solar system, as I said a moment ago, man is also a system. He is a much more complex system, and he is also governed by the properties of matter and energy. And we can't change that. That is the way it is. If you fall off the roof of your house, you're going to break something. It's just the way things are. Many of the laws that govern man can be discovered in time by man himself. You don't need anybody to tell you that some of the things you might consider doing are going to get you hurt, your kids hurt, somebody else hurt. You learn pretty soon not to do a lot of things. But some of the laws that govern relationships between human beings or the lives of human beings are so complex that man may never tumble to them and may never make the connection and may never understand what it is that did him in. So what shall we do about this man that we have made in terms of making him aware of what he ought to do and what he ought not to do? Now, we can write into man a system of logic, which I have made that point before, which God did. We have minds that operate according to a system of logic, and that logical system brings us inevitably to understand certain things that we don't even have to be told. There are certain things that we shouldn't have to be told. And so it is that civilizations around the world have come to certain conclusions. That it's really almost everywhere wrong for you to become involved with another man's wife. Everybody understands that, whatever civilization just about there is. They may have different ideas of what wives are and how many wives you can have, but they still know that somebody has a wife and you shouldn't mess around with his wife. So we have to understand that this happens. We see it in that. C.S. Lewis had some really interesting stuff in Mere Christianity about how it is that civilizations all around the world see certain things in common. But the logical system will only carry man so far. And sometimes it's just a little too expensive to have to learn these things by experience. And some people never learn by experience. We have to take another step. We have to reveal to man some key things about himself, about his relationship with his fellow man, and about his relationship with God. And if we don't tell man these things, he may never come to know them. Now, we don't know when that was done by God. All we know is that it was done, and this we absolutely do know. In Genesis chapter 26, God is talking to Abraham's son, Isaac. There was a terrible famine in the land. This was not the one that hit Abraham so hard and sent him down into Egypt. This is a different one entirely. This famine came along, and Isaac went down to Abimelech, the king of the Palestinians. Just as a side note, whenever you see the term Philistine in the Bible, you need to understand that that's the word from which Palestine is derived. The Philistines were the original Palestinians, and as far as I can tell, they were about the same kind of people. The Lord appeared to him and says, "Don't go down into Egypt. Live in the land I'm telling you of. Dwell in this land. I will be with you. I will bless you, for to you and your descendants I will give all these lands." So don't leave them. You know, it's a temptation, kind of a famine. Let's get the kids together and let's get somewhere where there's something to eat. So God says, no, you stay here because I want to give you this land. I'll perform what I swore to Abraham your father. I will make your descendants multiply like the stars of heaven. I will give to your descendants all these lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Now, why is God doing this? Verse 5. Because Abraham obeyed my voice, kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Now that is a fascinating piece of work right there, because it not only reveals to us that there were laws, it reveals that there was a system of laws. He tells us there was a known system of laws with structure, believe it or not, that Abraham knew about and Abraham followed as a way of life. You notice there were 4 parts to it: charge, commandments, statutes, laws. 4 parts, all law. And Abraham obeyed these laws, and God blessed him because of it. Now, are these statutes of God mere enactments that he could just as easily have omitted? You may have heard of the Wicked Bible. This was a Bible that way back when they were actually, this is in the early days of movable type, when all type was set by hand. They set this Bible up, and in the course of putting together the 10 Commandments, they left a little word "not" out of one of the commandments, the 7th. And it said, "Thou shalt commit adultery." There were, I think, about 1,000 of those Bibles produced, and King, John, I think, withdrew all of them, had them all gathered up and burned, except that a few of them got escaped from him. And I can't even imagine what those would be worth at auction if you could find one of them today. But they are around there. But the thing is, this particular law was changed that way. Well, now, what about it? Could God just as easily have said, "Thou shalt commit adultery"? Or are these laws that God could just as easily have repealed? For example, Congress makes a law. What do we usually conclude? They screwed up. You know, it was a mistake. The law was a bad idea. So they come back around and they repeal the thing and get it off the books. Now, we can also ask this question. Do these laws require a divine hand to enforce them? Such as a police officer who, if he's not there to enforce the law, you can break the law with impunity. No one will know. You pay no fine. Nothing happens. You see, the problem, though, is God doesn't drink coffee or eat donuts, and he never sleeps. So therefore, sometimes you may seem to get away with it, but obviously you're not getting away with it. Let me suggest another way to look at the law. Instead of it being arbitrary enactments, and this goes back to the beginning of the sermon, what if the laws of the Bible are descriptions of the properties of matter and energy as matter and energy are organized into man. Now, if that's true, you can't break these laws. Like you can't break the law of gravity, you have no choice. If you step off the edge of a building, you're going to fall. There is absolutely nothing you can do to prevent that from happening. And so consequently, if you lie, you will obey the law, in that the consequences of the lie will happen without enforcement, without police, without God so much as lifting a finger. The consequences will come. What are they? Well, if you think your way through on some of these things, it'll become evident that when you tell a lie and you get away with it, you lie to your neighbor, nobody ever finds out. The problem is you know it. And it was too easy. And you'll be tempted to lie again. And you have changed your character forever when you lie. Now, the same thing is true of fooling around with another man's wife. You have changed your character forever, who you are. You will never not have done that. Not ever. You may overcome it. You may be able to put it in your past. You may be able to have a perfectly good life and a perfectly good marriage, but nevertheless, you will never not have made that particular mistake. It's there. It's part of you. And this is what I mean when I say that these laws describe the properties of matter. They also describe the properties of human life, human relationships, and the relationship of man with God. And there are consequences. As I've said before, there are several things that can happen when you commit sin. Two particular things are consequences and punishment. God chastises or punishes to correct us and put our feet right. Consequences don't care. Consequences come rolling down the mountain on you no matter what. You drive drunk, you cause an accident, you are guilty of manslaughter, you may go to jail for 3 or 4 years and you're going to stay there. If you lose your arm in an accident like that, the arm is gone and God will not put it back. You're without the arm for the rest of your life. Consequences don't care. Now, what we have to, I think, come to understand is that the revelation of God in His law is a description for us of those things that will help us to avoid bad consequences in our lives. They're not there to keep us from having fun. They're not there to cause us, so that God will have something He can use to beat us over the head with. That's not what these things are for. Now, here's the thing. If, instead of being enactments that must be enforced to mean anything, what if they are a revelation of what works and what doesn't work in human relationships, in relationship with God? What if? If this is true, then how can they possibly be repealed? How can you do away with a law that is inexorably correct? It tells you what you are made of. It tells you what will happen to you if you do bad things. It tells you what bad things are. It tells you where the places are where you can fall down and hurt yourself. It's a lamp to your feet. It's a light to your path so you don't get hurt. Why would God repeal a law like that? Now, you would have just about as good a chance of repealing the law of gravity. If you did that, lost the moon, you've lost everything. And so when you repeal the law of God, you've lost your guide. You've lost the light. You have no more idea of what's going to happen in the world and in your own life than the man in the moon, if you'll pardon the expression. Now, by comparison, as I said, if you actually break some of these laws of God, you can also lose everything, even though you don't really realize what it is that's coming down. Now, I realize that what I've said so far is fairly simplistic. What I have said so far is that the law of God is revelatory, not regulatory. In other words, it isn't there needing enforcement. It is a description of the way things are in the world and how they work. That is, it reveals the difference between right and wrong behavior, and there is ample evidence that this was known in Genesis long before Moses. All of it's there. The time would then come, though, when Moses would bring 12 tribes, descendants of Israel, out of Egypt. And now would have come the problem of applying revealed law to the life of a community. Not only that, but of applying the law to a nation that would be 40 years in the desert, forced to live as a community, forced to occupy a relatively small space on the planet, forced to cooperate or die. Because, they really had to depend on each other during all those years in the desert. Now the law must be administered centrally to govern the relationships between the people and between the people and their God. Things had to be done. That meant there had to be administrative laws. In the Bible, they tend to be called judgments. During the time in the wilderness, they had two kinds of judgments: those of God and those of men. In Exodus, the 18th chapter, you find a pivotal point in this whole exercise of creating an administrative law for a people who are going to be 40 years in the desert. Exodus 18, it says, So it was on the next day that Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood before Moses from morning until evening. Now, this is the beginning of the cue, which the British have mastered to a fine art in subsequent years. Here you can see these people lined up, waiting to come to Moses for a judgment on some issue that had come up. And you can imagine, with all these people in the desert camped out together, with all the issues, the logistics, the problems, good grief. No wonder they would be staggered out, a whole long line and be waiting to see Moses from sunup to sundown. So when Moses' father-in-law saw all he was doing for the people, he said, What's this thing you're doing? Why do you alone sit and all the people stand before you from morning until evening? What's wrong with you? And Moses said to his father-in-law, Well, they come to me to inquire of God. When they have a difficulty, they come to me, and I judge between one another, and I make known to them his statutes and his laws. I explain all these things to him. So Jethro said to Moses, he said, Look, you're not doing this right. Both you and these people who are with you will surely wear yourselves out. It's too much. And you think about this for a while, that if you decide, well, I'm going to try to really keep the law of God in the Bible, you'll wear yourself out trying to sort out all of the issues and the problems that you will come across when you're reading through the law. It's complicated. Why is the law complicated? Because life is complicated, and the law is about life. How hard is this? So he said, this is not good. It's too much. You're going to mess it all up. Here's what I'm going to give you in the way of advice. I will give you counsel, and God will be with you. Stand before God for the people, so you may bring the difficulties to God. All right? And you shall teach them the statutes and laws, and show them the way in which they must walk, and the work they must do. Your job, Moses, is as the teacher. Moreover, you shall select from all the people able men, not just any men, able men, and men who fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness. Now you can begin to see, did I say hating truth? I said men of truth, hating covetousness. Now when you put this group together, they are men of ability who fear God. That's known in the way they live their lives. They are men of truth. If they tried to lie, their tongue would fall out. They hated covetousness. This means they can't be bribed. You haven't got enough money to get them to give these men the judgment that you want. Place them to be rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, and rulers of 10. Perfectly logical, so much so I can almost see Moses slapping his forehead and saying, why didn't I think of that? It's a standard pyramid of top-down rule, and I have no doubt that it made all kinds of sense in the wilderness, in those compact circumstances where those people had to live and work. He then said, let these people judge the people at all times. They can judge them day in and day out. Then it'll be if it's a great matter, they shall bring it to you. But every small matter, they themselves will judge. It will be easier for you, for they will bear the burdens with you. You realize that, remember, this went all the way down to a captain of 10. Now, let's pick out a little group of 10 people in this room here and say, look, if we have a problem among us, you bring it to John. And John's going to sit down with you. He'll listen to it, and he'll render a decision, and you all go home and get this thing done. Boy, does that start getting easy. With 10 people? Now, once in a blue moon, there should be something that maybe John couldn't sort out. Then we have to move a step further up, and we have to go for a captain of hundreds. But he's not dealing with the 100, really. He's dealing with the 10 people who deal with the 10. Okay? So that he can then deal with only those problems. And once again, that 10 will develop a kind of collegiality among themselves, to where they can work with stuff and solve problems. It's really a very useful system of governance for a people who have to be together in camp. He said, let them judge the people at all times. Every great matter they'll bring to you. All the small stuff they'll take care of themselves. Easier for you, they'll bear the burden with you. And of course, you can actually, if you look at it this way again, all the small stuff, the really small stuff, who gets to take care of that? You do. By yourself. If you don't really need to ask, don't ask. Because implicit in all this sort of thing is if you think you know the answer to it, what are you bothering the captain of 10 with it for? Except maybe for a little personal attention, maybe that's it. But anyway, the point simply is that in the main, you're supposed to handle the small stuff yourself. Somebody wrote a book recently called Don't Sweat the Small Stuff, and then the subtitle was, and it's all small stuff. Now, note the delegation of authority. Moses only had to deal with those cases that someone else decided required his attention. If you do this thing, this is really interesting the way Jethro puts this. If you do this thing and God so commands you, notice, we're not just going to develop this thing up in the grassroots. This is our idea. We'll just make this work. He said, it's only going to do this if it's God's will. If God commands you, then you'll be able to endure. All the people can go to their place in peace, and everybody can go do something else. They can sit around and tell stories by the fire. They can invent folk dances. They can do all kinds of stuff with their kids and so forth if they don't have to be standing in line all day. It makes a certain amount of sense. Okay, so Jethro wasn't trying to tell him to do something contrary to God's will, only if God approved. So Moses listened to the voice of his father-in-law and did all that he said. And he chose able men out of all Israel, made them heads over the people, rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50, rulers of 10. And they judged the people at all times. The hard cases they brought to Moses, they judged every small case themselves. Now, this is what is really the beginning of what some people call the oral law. It's right here. Whereas you guys all were sitting here, we're all out here in camp somewhere together. And 10 of you come to the guy that's the captain of your group with an issue that somehow you couldn't sort out by yourself. He listens to the case. He decides the case. You all go back and get about your business, taking care of your animals and your kids and all this kind of stuff. But this thing that he has decided becomes a precedent in law, so that we all know what John decided the last time we took something like this up there, right? And we all know that because John took it on up to the captains of 50 and 100, we know what they decided. And therefore, there's just not a whole lot of point in us bringing this to him again. We're going to get the same decision handed down we did before. Or we know what the decision is going to be because of what was decided before. So in Israel over these years, a set of traditions began to be developed. In later generations, the Jews began to call these oral law. By the time Jesus came along, he called it the traditions of the elders. No one in either Old Testament or New Testament ever uses the term oral law. It's a big thing in Judaism, but it was not when any of the Bible was being written. One of two things is true on this regard. Either it just wasn't known as the oral law and everybody called it the traditions of the elders, or else they called it the oral law and the New Testament writers refused to call it that. Because being the oral law implied that it was handed down to Moses from Sinai, which it was not. Only the core law was handed down to Moses. But after that, judgment after judgment after judgment after judgment began to develop a great body of tradition. And so it is that the Jewish body of tradition is very old, contains an enormous amount of wisdom, but it is not in and of itself the law of God. Okay, God backed the authority of these men, but their laws were the laws of men that cannot be escaped. The laws that these captains of 10 made, the captains of 50, or what have you, these were the laws, these were the regulations of men. Now, out of this, as I say, arose a body of case law, some of which was written, most of which was not. A good reason for it. Some of the rules of these men would become oppressive, as sure as day follows night. Once you attempt to start administering a law, create an administration to run a law, well, then you have to wind up building a fence around the law. And you have to then decide, well, we want to do this so that we don't break this law. And this would be a breaking of the law. As this judge says it is, this judge says it's not. And you can begin to see very quickly that any time you move into a legal system, things are going to get complicated very fast. Well, it did. Good reason for this, as I said, that some of the laws would become oppressive, and they must not be written down lest they become permanent. You follow me? Some of the laws of men would become oppressive, and they must not be written down lest they become permanent. Now, at this point, I have to return to something Jesus said. I hope you'll forgive me for occasionally repeating myself on some of these things, but these sermons go all over the place, and somebody's going to hear this idea for the first time. Matthew 5, verse 17. Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I come not to destroy, but to fulfill. Till heaven and earth pass, I tell you assuredly, not one jot or one tittle shall by no means pass from the law, till everything has come to pass. Whoever therefore breaks one of these least of these commandments and teaches men so, shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever does and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say to you, that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, I see what Jesus says here as an affirmation of the written law only. Because in the minds of many Jewish people, the law of God, the Torah, was handed down in two media, written and oral. But it is still one Torah. So that when they spoke of the law of Moses, they were talking about the oral law and the written law. Jesus, in saying not one jot or one tittle, is obviously speaking about the written law. He is not talking about the oral Torah at all, and the reason is going to become fairly quickly apparent in the Sermon on the Mount, because he is going to begin to challenge the traditions of the elders, as he calls them, almost immediately, saying, you have heard it said, but I say unto you. And I hadn't realized until recently how significant that was. Jacob Neusner, in his book, Judaism at the Time Christianity Began, talks about how the rabbis, and he cites illustrations of it, how when they are asked a question, they will say, well, Rabbi Eliezer said that, Rabbi Akiva said that, and they'll quote the third rabbi and give the answer that all these rabbis have given down through time as the weight. Jesus then will say, you have heard it was said by them of old time, doesn't name anybody. Then he says, but I say unto you. I hadn't realized how dramatic that was in Jewish society at the time, that he cited no rabbi. You have heard it said, but I am here to tell you. And he is the one who could tell them precisely that. The oral law will be categorized as traditions, which are to be respected, but which have no authority beyond the administration that actually teaches them. The reason? Because it can be categorically wrong. That's why. Take, for example, Mark chapter 7, where Jesus' disciples have been challenged over something they were doing. They said it wasn't lawful. And Jesus said to them, chapter 7, verse 9 of Mark, all too well you reject the commandment of God that you may keep your tradition. They were moaning and groaning about Jesus' disciples eating without washing their hands properly. He said, Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. But you say, if a man says to his father or mother, well, whatever profit you might have received from me is actually Corban, that is to say, it is a gift to God, then you no longer let him do anything for his father and mother. You release him completely from the obligation to support his elderly parents. The word honor, by the way, in the Greek, time, generally speaking, means to remunerate. We get our word honorarium, which basically has to do with a remuneration we give to a speaker or something. Basically, he says, honor your father and your mother means you take care of them in their old age. And what you guys are doing is saying they don't have to do that. All they have to do is say, oh, no, I'm sorry, I promised that to God, so I can't possibly give it to my parents. Then Jesus said, making the word of God of no effect through your tradition that you have handed down. And many such things you do. That word handed down is very Jewish, because their whole thing was of receiving and handing down. Everything was passed on orally in this way. Now, if you live in the community, you may be governed by the leadership, decisions made by the leadership of that community, but they have no divine authority. They are very similar to the laws of the state. Sometimes they even transgress divine authority, and you are absolutely under no obligation in that case. Matthew 23, verse 1. Then spoke Jesus to the multitude and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All therefore, whatever they bid you to observe, that observe and do. But don't you do after their works. They say, and they don't do. They bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. That's interesting. So that the Pharisees, the scribes, were the governors in the religious community of Judah. And their decisions that they were handing down were the decisions of the community. If you're going to live in this community, you've got to live by these things. Now, where have we come? We've seen that there's a distinction to be drawn between two categories of law. What we call them is not very important because it's really easy to confuse the semantics of them. I think it was Thomas Aquinas who postulated that there were three categories of law. There were moral, civic, and ceremonial. So that then the discussion goes off into the questions of moral, civic, and ceremonial. I don't think these get the jobs done, so for my purposes, I'm going to call these two categories natural law and administrative law. Natural law are those things that you can't repeal because they're just very much in the basis in the way people, operate. Administrative law is something else. Natural law describes what is and cannot be changed. It is buried in the properties of energy and matter. While it does not describe penalties always, it always describes, or actually implies, consequences. Some of the consequences are only seen in distant hindsight. It's awfully easy for me sitting where I am today to look back 50 years and say, oh, how could I have? How stupid that was. I had no idea where that would lead to. Some of the consequences can only be seen that way. Natural law cannot be repealed. That said, administrative law, once it is written down, cannot be repealed either. And so it's crucial that we keep this distinction between written and oral apart, because among Jews, that oral law still being handed down generation after generation is still very much binding upon them. That is upon some Jews. Some Jews pay no attention to it at all. But anyway, administrative law, once it is written, can't be repealed either, because Jesus said, not one jot, not one tittle can pass from the law till heaven and earth are gone, and they are still out there. So, what are we supposed to do with this? Well, if you adopt a legalistic approach to the law, you very quickly run smack dab into absurdity. And it's right here that a very important concept lies. It's a concept a lot of people don't want to think about because of the implications it carries with it. I want to try to illustrate this, so I'll pick one law, and we'll talk about the implications of this one law. It's familiar. Deuteronomy 25, verse 4, one line. You shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. Now, what am I supposed to do about that? Am I supposed to go out and buy a yoke of oxen? That would be absurd, more than you know. On the other hand, could we say that if I were using oxen to thresh grain, and I'll bet there are some places in the world to this day while that's being done. If I were using oxen to thresh grain, I must not muzzle that ox. I would say, yeah, I think that that's true. But since I won't be doing that, I can safely ignore the passage, even though it's written in the law, correct? Well, maybe not. Paul didn't. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 3. 1 Corinthians 9, verse 3. Now, what's happening here is the Apostle Paul is taking heat from the Corinthians. So he's going to say, my answer to them who examine me is this. Now, you have to remember that when he first came to Corinth, he lived with Aquila and Priscilla and worked at a trade. He was a tent maker, so that he wouldn't be chargeable to anybody in Corinth. In fact, as far as I can tell in Paul's epistles, he was at great pains not to ever take any money from the Corinthians. It's almost as though he perceived a potential problem and decided he's going to sidestep it from the beginning. But he did receive help from the Philippian church on more than one occasion. Other churches elsewhere helped him so he wouldn't have to charge the Corinthians nothing. But he still came under question. Oddly enough, of all places I would not have expected it here, but here it is. He says, do I not have the right to eat and drink? Do we have no right to take along a believing wife, as the other apostles, the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I have no right to forbear working? Are we the only two of all the people who do the work of God that we really have got to go out and get a job and we can't take any money from anybody for anything? Is this the way it's going to be? Now, I assume from this that it was well known, it would be understood by the people that we're talking to, that Peter and the others were living on expenses being paid by churches. Now he wants to know, what's the matter with you people? Barnabas and I, we're the only ones that are going to have to go through this. By the way, the word right, as it's used here, is a word, that Greek word that basically means authority. And it implies, don't we have the authority to forbear working? Don't we have the authority, if we had a wife, to have the wife come along with us, with money being paid by churches? He says, whoever goes to war at his own expense, who plants a vineyard and doesn't eat of its fruit, who tends a flock and does not drink of the milk of the flock? Now, do I say these things just as a man? I'm using logic, but is that all I've got? Or does the law say the same thing also? Is it? No, it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Now, what are we, 25 years after everything that was nailed to the cross was nailed there? And Paul writes to a Gentile church citing Old Testament scripture to prove his point. It's an authority. He says, it's not just my idea. Let me cite the scripture. He says, is God concerned about oxen? Does he say it altogether for our sakes? Is this an animal rights issue? No. He says it's for our sakes that this is written, that he who plows should plow in hope, he who threshes in hope should be a partaker of hope. If we have sown spiritual things for you, is it a great thing if we reap your material things? Now, the logic of what Paul is saying here is inescapable. It's clear as crystal. But what I think is utterly fascinating is the way in which Paul, you start thinking, some people say, well, you've got the law of God and you've got the law of Moses. The law of Moses has been done away with, but the law of God is still in effect. Oh, really? Well, okay. But here's Paul, 25 years after the cross, saying, it's in the law of Moses, and this is the authority I'm going to cite for you. The law of Moses. As I say, it's not an animal rights issue. It's a matter of principle. Later, writing to Timothy, he says this, chapter 5, 1 Timothy 5, verse 17. Let the elders who rule well be accounted worthy of double honor. There's that word honor, basically means honorarium. Especially those who labor in the word and doctrine. For the scripture says, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain, and the laborer is worthy of his wages. What are you going to do? Here's the Apostle Paul saying, now here is a law. That law is still here to advise us as to how we are to treat people. In this particular case, how to treat people who work full-time in the ministry. It's okay to pay them. They're working hard at doing the gospel. They're worthy of their wages. Now, there's a funny thing, by the way, about this word scripture. It's the Greek word graphia, which means writings. He doesn't say the Torah, interestingly enough. He doesn't even use the Greek word nomos, which he sometimes uses in place of Torah. He uses a word for writings, the scriptures, once again making the distinction between written law and oral law. He cites scripture, which means stuff written down. Now, I'm amazed every time I come across somebody who believes that we don't need the Old Testament. Paul cites it constantly. In the 16 chapters of the book of Romans, I think he cites the Old Testament directly 46 times. 46 times. It's incredible to think about that. Why? It's the Scriptures. It's the only Scriptures they had. You know, we cite the New Testament a lot because we've got them. He didn't have them. Now, there's a problem lurking in the background, and I want to address it by calling your attention to two Scriptures. Deuteronomy 17 and verse 8. This is one you ought to try to remember because it's very important. It is that Scripture which establishes the principle of a judiciary. We're all familiar from endless repetition in civics class and what have you about the three branches of our government: the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary. Well, God was the legislator for Israel. Moses was the executive. There was also to be a judiciary. In Deuteronomy 17, verse 8, if a matter arises which is too hard for you to judge, between degrees of guilt for bloodshed, between one judgment or another, or between one punishment or another, matters of controversy within your gates, then you shall arise and go up to the place which the Lord your God chooses. You shall come to the priests, the Levites, and to the judge that's there in those days, and inquire of them, and they shall pronounce upon you the sentence of judgment. To courts. Too hard for you? Get down to the judges, present the case, they'll decide it. What you're looking at here is an example of binding arbitration. First of all, did you have to go? No, you didn't have to go. The fact that you went says this is too hard for us. So you go down there to get them to decide it. He says, you shall then do according to the sentence they pronounce upon you in the place which the Lord your God chooses. You shall be careful to do according to all that they order you, according to the sentence of the law in which they instruct you, according to the judgment which they tell you. You shall do it. You are not to turn aside to the left or the right from the sentence they pronounce upon you. Now the man who acts presumptuously and will not heed the priest that stands to minister there before the Lord your God, or the judge, that man shall die. So you shall put away the evil from Israel, and all the people shall hear and fear, and no more act presumptuously. The word presumptuously, by the way, Hebrew means insolently. Insolent. High-handedness with an attitude. Now, the other scriptures in question are two more of them, both of them related to the same thing. Matthew 16:16 and Matthew 18:18. This is the occasion where Jesus asked the disciples, who do you say the Son of Man is? Peter said, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And he said, well, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. God has revealed that to you, not men. Then he says, I'm going to build my church upon this rock, and I will give unto you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, so that whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. And goes on from there. Now, there has been much mischief that has grown up around that particular verse. One of them being the fact that Peter was given the keys to the kingdom of heaven, that he's the one, he is the apostle that is going to be succeeded down through time. But in Matthew 18:18, he says the same thing to all of them. And basically what he's saying in Matthew 18:18 is to the church, to the apostles, to the leadership, I am giving the power to make decisions that are binding and loosing, and whatever is bound on earth, bound in heaven. Loosed on earth, loosed in heaven. Now, do you hear the echoes of that from Deuteronomy 17? That you don't have to go ask these questions. But if you go ask these questions, and if you get a decision, and you act presumptuously and ignore them, you're going to die. What he is doing here, he is now passing the mantle of the judiciary from the Pharisees, the scribes, the Jews, and what have you in their judicial system to his apostles and to the church. Which leaves the church really in a lot of ways with a very important decision. And Paul will deal with this on several occasions in his epistles when he says, good grief, folks, can't you judge the smallest things in your own church that you have to have people going down to the courts, the county courthouse to get these things sorted out? That basically what he's telling the church is you have certain obligations on these things. And whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. But woe be to you if you try to bind something on earth contrary to God's law. Right? We can play around with our traditions. We can play around with our decisions, our corporate decisions, this kind of thing. We cannot mess with the law of God that is written for us to follow. We don't have to go out and buy ourselves an oxen. But you are so much better off in life if you have filed away in your memory certain little sayings like, you don't muzzle the ox that treads out the corn. One day, an old friend of mine, and Charles Hunting and I were talking about a young couple in college. He's a big old ox of a man, as it were, but no particular comparison there. But he was saying they shouldn't get married. And I said, what? And I was kind of thinking, well, no, big mistake. And I said, well, what is why are you saying that? He said, well, it's a biblical principle. I said, what is it? He says, the Bible says, you shall not plow with an ox and an ass together. And the young man's behavior was so much resembling an ass in many ways that it actually broke every one of us up. I don't think they ever did get married. But it is really true that there are so many lessons in the law of God that the person who spends his time there, who meditates on them, who sits back with a cup of coffee, puts his feet up and tries to sort out in his mind, how on earth would I apply that in the modern world, is going to have an edge on just about everybody he comes to deal with in life. Now, if you're tired of hearing about the law, you'll have to let me know. But right now I'm working on a book. And so you may have to get used to hearing quite a bit about it over the next few months.